fear of little men. You see,
The 1970s was a different era for children's entertainment. Before parental ratings were strictly enforced, and before studios worried too much about shielding young audiences from disturbing content, kids were exposed to movies that left lasting psychological marks. These weren't horror films marketed to adults. They were movies that kids actually watched, either in theaters with their families or on television during prime time. They featured scenes of violence, death, environmental disaster, and existential dread that would never make it into a family film today. Here are 10 movies that traumatized kids from the 1970s.
Who can take a rainbow?
Number 10, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. This musical fantasy film seemed innocent enough on the surface. A poor boy wins a tour of a magical chocolate factory. But Gene Wilder's portrayal of Willy Wonka was unsettling in ways that children couldn't quite articulate. He wasn't a warm, grandfatherly figure. He was unpredictable, sarcastic, and seemed to enjoy watching the misbehaving children meet their fates. His expression barely changed when Augustus got sucked up the pipe or Violet turned into a blueberry. The boat tunnel sequence became legendary for traumatizing an entire generation of kids. Wonka took the children on a psychedelic nightmare ride through a tunnel filled with disturbing images. A chicken getting its head cut off, a centipede crawling across a human face, flashing lights, and Wonka reciting what sounded like dark poetry while the children screamed in terror. It came out of nowhere in what was supposed to be a fun family movie, and it left kids genuinely frightened. The Oompa Loompas singing cheerful songs about children's horrible fates while those children were presumably dying or being permanently disfigured added another layer of disturbing content. Violet's father desperately asking how to get the juice out of his daughter, while the Oompa Loompas sang and danced, created a contrast between horror and celebration that children found deeply unsettling. The fact that Wonka showed no real concern for any of the children except Charlie made him seem less like a magical benefactor and more like someone conducting cruel experiments. The factory itself was a place of hidden dangers beneath its whimsical surface. Every room presented new threats, machinery that could grind you up, experimental products that could transform your body, heights you could fall from. The bright colors and candy coating made it seem like a paradise, but kids watching understood it was actually a death trap for anyone who broke the rules. Even the fizzy lifting drinks scene, where Charlie and Grandpa Joe nearly got chopped to pieces by a ceiling fan, was terrifying. The lighthearted music playing while they were about to die horribly created that same disturbing tonal disconnect. Kids left theaters having nightmares about being turned into blueberries, drowned in chocolate rivers, or incinerated in incinerators. The movie's lasting impact came from how it presented genuine danger and potential death in the context of a children's fantasy.
We're sorry, but you had become unreliable.
Number 9. Soylent Green, 1973. This science fiction film depicted a dystopian future where overpopulation and environmental collapse had destroyed the food supply, forcing people to eat processed wafers called Soylent Green. The movie's vision of 2022 showed people sleeping on staircases, riots over food, and a world where natural resources like water and strawberries were luxuries only the wealthy could afford. For kids watching this, it was a terrifying preview of what the future might hold. The film's most famous scene showed Charlton Heston's character discovering the horrifying truth about what Soylent Green was actually made from. His screaming revelation became cultural shorthand for disturbing discoveries, but for kids who saw it in theaters or on television, it was genuinely traumatic. The idea that society had become so desperate that it had resorted to this solution and that the government was lying to everyone about it planted seeds of distrust and fear. The assisted suicide scene, where Edward G. Robinson's character chose to die while watching beautiful images of the natural world that no longer existed, was heartbreaking and disturbing. He watched whales, deer, and flowing streams while knowing that his young friend would never see these things in real life. The gentle beauty of that scene made the darkness of the world outside even more horrifying by contrast. This was Robinson's final film role, and knowing that added an extra layer of poignancy to his character's death scene. The movie showed violence over food rations, with riot police scooping up protesters with garbage trucks like they were trash. The casual dehumanization of people in this overcrowded world was chilling. Women were treated as property, furniture that came with expensive apartments, which exposed kids to dystopian gender politics they couldn't fully understand but found disturbing. Kids who watched this movie started looking at their food differently and questioning what adults told them about the world. The environmental message was bleak and offered no hope, no solution. It simply showed a world that had destroyed itself through greed and overpopulation, and suggested that humanity's future was one of desperate survival and moral compromise. That level of hopelessness was difficult for children to process, especially when the movie suggested this future was inevitable.
Look at her! It could be something else. You didn't even examine her.
Number 8. The Poseidon Adventure, 1972. This disaster film about a luxury ocean liner capsizing on New Year's Eve trapped a generation of kids with claustrophobic terror. The movie showed people drowning, burning to death, falling into flames, and dying in increasingly horrible ways while trying to escape the overturned ship. What made it particularly traumatic was that it could happen to anyone. These were ordinary people on a cruise, celebrating a holiday, when disaster struck without warning. The character deaths were personal and devastating. When the ship's chaplain sacrificed himself by jumping into steam to turn a valve, kids watched him die screaming in agony to save the others. When Shelley Winter's character drowned after swimming through an underwater passage to help the group escape, her husband's grief was palpable and real. These weren't faceless casualties. They were characters the audience had gotten to know and care about. The underwater swimming scenes created intense anxiety in young viewers. Watching characters hold their breath, swim through dark, flooded corridors, and wonder if they'd make it to the other side before drowning made kids feel like they were suffocating along with them. Some children developed lasting fears of swimming or being underwater after watching this movie. The movie's depiction of chaos and panic felt realistic and terrifying. When the ship first capsized, people were thrown across the ballroom, crushed by furniture, impaled on debris. The survivors had to walk on ceilings and climb through upside-down corridors, which created spatial disorientation that made viewers feel lost and trapped along with the characters. Every decision about which path to take could mean life or death. The ending offered no triumphant rescue or happy resolution, just a handful of survivors emerging from the wreck, traumatized and having lost people they loved. The movie showed that sometimes there are no heroes who can save everyone, that random chance determines who lives and who dies, and that survival often means watching others perish. Those were harsh lessons delivered through a mainstream disaster film that families watched together. Number 7, Jaws, 1975. Steven Spielberg's thriller about a great white shark terrorizing a beach community didn't just scare kids. It fundamentally changed how an entire generation felt about the ocean. The opening scene, where a young woman went skinny dipping and was violently attacked by an unseen predator, set the tone for a movie that made water itself seem dangerous. The shark attacks throughout the film were brutal and realistic. When the young boy on the raft was killed, the movie showed his blood filling the water and his mother's anguished screaming on the beach. It wasn't sanitized or quick. It was drawn out and horrible. Kids watching realized that being a child didn't protect you from becoming prey, that the ocean didn't care how old you were. The USS Indianapolis speech, where Quint described surviving a shark attack that killed hundreds of his shipmates during World War II, was terrifying in a different way. His description of watching men being taken one by one, of dolls' eyes going black, created vivid mental images that were somehow worse than what the movie showed directly. Kids listening to that monologue imagined themselves in that water, surrounded by sharks, waiting to be next. The underwater perspective shots, where the camera showed the shark's point of view approaching swimmers from below, made every swimming scene afterwards feel dangerous. Kids who went to the beach after seeing Jaws couldn't help but imagine that same perspective tracking them through the water. The movie had weaponized the ocean's mystery. You couldn't see what was beneath you, and that invisible threat became more terrifying than anything visible could have been. The movie's impact extended far beyond the theater. Kids who'd previously loved swimming in the ocean suddenly refused to go past knee-deep water. Public pools seemed dangerous because of that irrational fear that a shark might somehow appear. The movie had tapped into a primal fear of being eaten by a predator, and it did so effectively enough that some people never fully recovered their comfort with ocean swimming. Beaches reported decreased attendance after the movie's release, showing just how deeply it had affected public consciousness.
Oh, Hazel, this is where it comes from.
Number 6. Watership Down, 1978. This British animated film about rabbits looked like it should be a gentle children's movie, but it was actually a violent, disturbing tale of survival, totalitarianism, and death. The opening sequence featured a brutal creation myth showing the rabbit god Frith threatening to destroy all rabbits, setting the dark tone immediately. Parents who took young children to see this, expecting something like Disney, were horrified by what unfolded. The movie showed rabbits being gassed, trapped, strangled by snares, torn apart by dogs, and killed by other rabbits in graphic detail. The animation didn't shy away from showing blood, wounds, and the terror in the rabbits' eyes as they died. The scene in the warren where rabbits were being systematically killed by humans featured disturbing imagery of rabbits choking and convulsing as poison gas filled their tunnels. General Woundwort, the antagonist, was genuinely frightening. A scarred, brutal rabbit dictator who ruled through fear and violence. The final battle between him and the dog was savage, with both animals tearing at each other while Woundwort refused to surrender even as he was being mauled. The movie never showed his death directly, leaving kids to imagine his fate, which was somehow worse. The vision sequences, particularly the ones featuring the rabbit god El Herrera and the black rabbit of Inlay, Death, were nightmarish. The black rabbit appeared as a dark, ghostly figure accompanied by ominous music, and his appearances signaled that death was coming. Kids had nightmares about that shadowy figure for years after seeing the film. The movie explored themes of freedom versus security through different rabbit societies. The warren, where rabbits were kept safe but essentially livestock waiting to be snared, showed how comfort could be a trap. These were complex political and philosophical ideas presented through animated rabbits getting violently killed, which made the whole experience surreal and disturbing. What made this particularly traumatic was that it was animated, which in the 1970s meant it was supposed to be for children. Parents didn't screen it first because the format suggested it would be appropriate. The movie's themes of displacement, war, dictatorship, and mortality were complex and dark, presented without the cushioning that usually softened such topics in children's media. Kids came out of theaters crying and confused, having watched what looked like a cartoon but felt like a war movie. Number 5. The Exorcist, 1973. Though rated R, this movie was widely seen by children who sneaked into theaters, had older siblings take them, or watched it on cable a few years later. The story of a young girl possessed by a demon traumatized kids in ways few other horror films managed. The fact that the victim was a child herself made it even more disturbing. If this could happen to Reagan, a normal girl living in a nice house, it could happen to anyone. The transformation scenes showed Reagan's face becoming distorted, her voice changing to something inhuman, and her body contorting in impossible ways. The famous head-spinning scene violated every rule about how human bodies should work, creating a visceral wrongness that was deeply unsettling. Kids who saw it often slept with lights on for weeks afterward, terrified that demons might possess them while they slept. The medical testing sequences were traumatic in their own way. Watching Regan undergo painful procedures, having needles jabbed into her neck while she screamed, showed that even doctors and modern medicine were helpless against this force. The combination of medical horror and supernatural terror created multiple layers of fear. The movie suggested that evil was real, that it could enter your home, and that even priests performing exorcisms might not be able to stop it. Both priests involved in the exorcism died trying to save Regan, which undermined the idea that good always triumphed over evil. Kids raised with religious faith found their beliefs challenged by a movie that showed demons as powerful and deadly, capable of killing even holy men. The sound design was particularly effective at creating lasting trauma. The demon's voice, the unsettling music, and the sounds of Regan's possessed movements created an audio landscape that stuck in viewers' memories. Years later, people who saw it as children could still recall specific sounds that had haunted them.
Now concentrating on the ship itself, so far with no results.
Number 4. The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951/TV broadcasts in the 70s. While originally released in 1951, this film was frequently broadcast on television throughout the 1970s, where it reached a new generation of children. The story of an alien named Klaatu, who arrived on Earth with a powerful robot to warn humanity about nuclear weapons, resonated differently with kids watching during the Cold War era. The robot Gort was terrifying in his featureless, imposing presence. When he activated his death ray and began disintegrating weapons and tanks, it demonstrated a power that no military could match. The scene where Gort advanced on soldiers while they fired uselessly at him, then vaporized them, showed that humanity's weapons were useless against superior technology. For kids growing up during the Cold War, this added another layer to their existing nuclear anxieties. Klaatu's message was essentially an ultimatum. Stop your violent ways or be destroyed. He demonstrated the seriousness of this threat by shutting down all electrical power on Earth for 30 minutes, showing that he could cripple human civilization whenever he chose. The implication was that Earth was being monitored by powerful alien forces who would eliminate humanity if we became too dangerous. The movie's ending offered no real comfort. Klaatu left Earth after warning that any future aggression would result in the planet's destruction. Kids watching understood that humanity was essentially on probation, that we were being judged by beings far more powerful than us, and that we'd already come close to being wiped out. Combined with real-world fears about nuclear war, this movie reinforced the feeling that civilization hung by a thread.
This is called a scrumdiddlyumptious bar.
Scrumdiddlyumptious bar.
Number 3. Willy Wonka's Boat Ride, 1971. The boat ride sequence in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory deserves its own entry because of its unique power to traumatize children. This 2-minute scene came out of nowhere in what had been a relatively lighthearted musical, suddenly plunging into nightmarish imagery that seemed designed to terrify young viewers. Gene Wilder's performance during this sequence was genuinely unsettling. He began reciting what sounded like stream of consciousness poetry, while his voice grew more intense and his face showed an expression somewhere between ecstasy and madness. The children and their parents in the boat were clearly frightened, screaming and begging him to stop. But Wonka seemed to enjoy their fear. The images flashing on the tunnel walls were disturbing and random. A chicken getting its head cut off, a millipede crawling on someone's face, psychedelic patterns, distorted faces. The editing was frantic and disorienting, with images appearing too quickly to fully process but slowly enough to create lasting impressions. The lighting shifted between harsh reds and sickly greens, adding to the nightmarish quality. What made this sequence particularly effective at causing trauma was its unexpectedness. Kids weren't prepared for this sudden shift into horror, and neither were their parents. There was no warning, no way to look away or cover your eyes before the disturbing images appeared. The scene embedded itself in children's memories because it violated the implicit contract that a musical fantasy would stay fantastical and fun.
Maybe I could find an extra slice of pie somewhere.
No, you can't serve him.
Number 2, Escape to Witch Mountain, 1975. This Disney film about 2 orphaned children with psychic powers being pursued by a wealthy villain seemed relatively tame, but several scenes left lasting impressions on young viewers. The opening showed the children experiencing terrifying premonitions and memories they couldn't understand, creating an atmosphere of confusion and dread that children in the audience could relate to. The scenes where the children were essentially being hunted by adults who wanted to exploit their powers tapped into primal fears about being powerless and at the mercy of threatening grown-ups. Aristotle Bolt, the villain, wasn't cartoonishly evil. He was cold, calculating, and determined to control the children for profit. His businessman demeanor made him more frightening than a stereotypical villain would have been. The psychic phenomena the children experienced, seeing through others' eyes, moving objects with their minds, having visions of catastrophes, was portrayed as frightening rather than fun. The children were scared of their own abilities and didn't understand where they came from. This confusion and fear resonated with kids who sometimes felt out of control of their own thoughts and emotions. The movie's atmosphere was consistently ominous, with the children never truly safe until the very end. Even in moments of calm, there was an underlying tension that kept young viewers anxious. The reveal that the children were actually aliens from another planet added existential questions about identity and belonging that were heavy for a children's film.
Vern, I know more about raising pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now, run along.
Number 1, Charlotte's Web, 1973. The animated adaptation of E.B. White's beloved book traumatized an entire generation of children with its unflinching portrayal of death. The movie opened with Fern's father heading out to kill Wilbur simply because he was the runt of the litter, immediately establishing that death was a real threat in this world. Young children watching had to confront the fact that some animals were killed just for being small or weak. The entire plot centered on Wilbur's desperate attempt to avoid being slaughtered and eaten. This wasn't abstract danger. The movie made clear that Wilbur would be killed, butchered, and turned into bacon and ham if Charlotte couldn't save him. Kids had to sit with the knowledge that this friendly, innocent pig they'd grown to love was destined for the dinner table unless something changed. Charlotte's death was handled with a gentleness that made it even more devastating. After saving Wilbur's life through her web writing, she died alone at the fairgrounds because she'd used all her energy to lay her egg sac. Wilbur and the other animals couldn't save her. They could only accept that her time had come. The movie showed her getting weaker and weaker, then quietly dying, with her voice fading to nothing. The scene where Wilbur returned to the barn with Charlotte's egg sac, knowing she was dead, broke children's hearts in theaters across the country. Templeton, the rat's callous attitude toward her death contrasted sharply with Wilbur's grief, showing that not everyone mourned the same way. When Charlotte's children hatched and most of them flew away, leaving Wilbur alone again, it reinforced that even after death, life moved on and things changed. What made this movie particularly traumatic was that it was presented as a children's story, but dealt honestly with mortality, loneliness, and the unfairness of death. Charlotte saved Wilbur's life, but couldn't save her own. She died having accomplished her purpose, but still died. Still left her friend behind. Kids learned that being good and kind didn't protect you from death, that saying goodbye was permanent, and that grief was something you had to learn to live with. The movie didn't soften these lessons or provide false comfort. It showed death as a natural part of life, but acknowledged that natural didn't mean easy or fair. Children left theaters crying, having lost a friend along with Wilbur, and carrying a new understanding of mortality that would stay with them forever. These movies didn't just scare kids temporarily, they became part of our psychological landscape, shaping how we understood danger, death, and the darker aspects of life. They showed up in nightmares for years afterward, influenced our fears and anxieties, and became shared experiences that defined a generation. The 1970s didn't believe in protecting children from harsh realities, and these films reflected that philosophy. Looking back, there's something almost quaint about being traumatized by movies when today's children have access to far more graphic and disturbing content through the internet. But these films worked differently. They were communal experiences, watched in theaters or gathered around the television with family, and they arrived when kids had fewer exposures to media violence and disturbing imagery. The impact was amplified by our innocence. These movies taught us that the world could be dangerous, that not every story had a happy ending, and that sometimes terrible things happen to good people, or good rabbits, or friendly pigs, or innocent children. They prepared us for a complex world by not shielding us from its realities, even if that preparation came with nightmares and anxiety. Whether that approach was better or worse than modern protective parenting remains debatable, but there's no question that these films left their mark. If these movies brought back some intense childhood memories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more trips down memory lane. Drop a comment and tell us which of these films affected you the most, or if there are other 70s movies that traumatized you that we didn't mention. We'd love to hear your stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.